We are back with a discussion on gun culture in America, and the emphasis this time is on its effects abroad. There is a kind of, I can't say it's a lullaby, but a suggestion that was made, or the news that I heard was that during the Iraq invasion, that what Americans did was that they first allowed the Iraqi National Armed Forces. They were basically dismissed, and these were trained soldiers who had access to weapons, and when the conflict was increased, of course, then it was a good opportunity for American soldiers to go now and fight them. Logically, that is it sounds very stupid, to be blunt, that if they wanted law and order and peace in Iraq, Iraq had a standing army, and many of them would have been recruits or have joined the army out of necessity or even coercion by the Ba'ath Party. So they may have been allowed, they could have been convinced to serve their country if we had made a transition after the fall of Saddam Hussein, if we had made a transition, but a peaceful transition, and if we had allowed the Iraqi armed forces to keep law and order in the country under some form of a martial law, for instance, that would not have been a problem. But if that had been the case, and Iraq had tons of weapons, it had one of the largest standing armies in the Middle East, to go back to the argument I was making, then we wouldn't have had the opportunity to sell more weapons. And so, in my opinion, that was deliberate. And so Americans had to use their own weapons, which of course are bought from the weapon manufacturers through the Pentagon, taxpayers' money. So the war profiteering was a major element in that. And of course, again, we are talking about politicians who primarily serve the interests of the lobbyists, the gun lobby in this respect. However nicely they may code to their words, their action amounts to nothing but to serve that interest. And so therefore, Iraq went into a civil war, and weapons were there, and weapons were poured in afterwards. And American soldiers went there with their weapons, and so with the abundance of weapons, Iraq became a mess. And the claim that the government made is that, oh, we have invaded Iraq, or sorry, they wouldn't say that they went to Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein because we wanted to deliver democracy. And the behavior of the American soldiers was nothing but an invading army that was breaking into people's homes and businesses and everything. And the anecdotal evidence, the stories that were told, was that at night people did not feel secure, that they were expecting American soldiers to break in at any time, on any pretext, because that's where you have to really fuel the fire of the civil war. And that Iraqi mothers used to tell their children at night, hush baby, hush, democracy may break in the door at any time now, to frighten them into falling asleep. Now, this American boot print weighs heavily on the legally disempowered and politically disenfranchised in many societies around the world. Iraq, Afghanistan included, of course. Now Syria, Libya, Somalia, and the list goes on. And taunting our warrior culture, posturing we promote democracy abroad as our national interest. This doesn't jibe well with the United States being the #1 exporter of conventional arms, and by all indications of small arms as well. This is the second part of the argument I'm making, is that the United States not only exports landmines, but it adamantly opposes signing the ban on landmines that kills tens of thousands of civilians around the world for years, even after the armed conflicts have ended. Remember, Princess Diana had that campaign going on. That probably died with her, or if not, it might be in coma that needs to be resuscitated. For the United States to claim to be exporting democracy and yet standing in the way of putting a ban on landmines. Who manufactures landmines? Again, mostly Americans. And when the conflicts are over, we may not hear of what's happening in those countries afterwards. But those landmines kill poor children, shepherds, fuel and wood gatherers in the mountains of Afghanistan. Yes, many of those mines were planted by the Soviets, but Americans had their share of it as well. And the landmine monitor identified at least 73,576 casualties in 119 countries and areas in the decade ending in 2009. Now, we are in 2016, so obviously those numbers have also must have continued and increased. But to think that more than 73,000 casualties, these would be civilians. These would be children. These would be women going to fetch water. And these would be in places where everyone says, well, the war is over and peace had prevailed. And yet in reality, there may not be peace. The total number of survivors worldwide is estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. And of those, Afghanistan tops the list, at least in terms of the data I have here. The devastation caused by these landmines make them the real weapons of mass destruction. Yes, if you're killing more than 73,000, those are weapons of mass destruction for the world community at large, whose typical victims are, again, like I said, children collecting wood for fire and fuel, or children who are tending sheep in their backyards, and women fetching water. These are all civilians who are not engaged in a war, and they are not in the battlefield, and they are not in the crossfire. They are in a quiet, nice, peaceful environment, and suddenly a landmine explodes and they lose an arm or a leg or their whole life. Our own children here in the United States, they're also exposed to the gun culture. And this is through an intergenerational transfer of violence, which is bad. Remember, the Second Amendment, if it had anything to do with gun ownership, happened more than 230 years ago. But the American society, even centuries after, centuries later, are still gung-ho about gun ownership, and the gun culture has become part of their identity. So the intergenerational transfer of this violence that continues is a real sad story indeed. We have grown numb to the oddity that among the victims of the Aurora tragedy was a 6-year-old child who was taken to see the violent movie, and that the youngest attendee of the midnight premiere was only 4 months old. So our obsession with guns, with violence, and of course that's not what they would call them, action movies, and what happens in action movies. It makes people think that such violence is a norm, not an exception. And why would you take a 4-month-old baby to see an action movie, regardless of whether he or she could understand it? And if you look at the tragedy that a 6-year-old kid who was taken to see this violent movie was also killed, 6-year-old. And we go through this whole process of rating movies and TV shows for prime time and otherwise to make sure that our children are not exposed, because we don't have control over what is being shown on TV. And therefore we pass legislations and we pass laws, impose restrictions on the airing of violent movies on or shows on TV. And then you have parents who have taken their 4-month-old, their 6-year-old children to see a violent movie deliberately. What are they teaching them? Values that they think are normal. This indeed is a sick society in this regard. And then we also had, I think, a therapist by the name of the Bethany Marshall, who told one of the radio stations at the time that another mother took her two 5-year-olds, twins, 2 5-year-old kids, to the court proceedings in the Aurora case the next day, because she wanted them to remember this historical day. For her, this was historical, to expose 5-year-old children to the court proceedings so that they could see a mass murder on trial, or at least presented for a hearing. And then when we want to have role models for our children, and this is how our parents behave, it's really shameful. Even more shocking was the another account of the Florida Secretary of State at the time, Sandra Mortham, taking her children to watch an electric chair execution. Okay? This is the Secretary of State, a high-ranking official in the state of Florida, and I think we know of enough secretaries of states in Florida who have devastated our political process. But in this case, this woman, and again, not a man, a woman, a mother, who's supposed to be a nurturing being, who is supposed to be opposed to violence, because she, as a mother, has brought the child into life. So the value of life ought to be important to her. The preservation of life, the sustenance of life, the nurturing of life should be important. So that person would be role modeling someone in that sense, how to preserve life, and yet she takes her children to watch an electric chair execution. And her statement was it was for purely for educational purposes. What an education. And then we have the case of an American banker who takes his children to a West Bank shooting range. And this is an interesting situation. He's an American. Okay, an American banker who takes his children to a West Bank, and we are talking about the West Bank in Palestine, Israel, to a West Bank shooting range for the purpose of teaching them values. To teach them values as they shoot targets of Palestinians. Let's see if we can have that slide number 5. Okay, this is according to Akiva Novik of the Ynet News that have put up that picture of that family. The father who's teaching his daughter how to shoot Palestinians for targets. Control room, can we have slide number 5, please? So upon entering the range, his 5-year-old daughter, Tamara, bursts into tears. And a half hour later, she's holding a gun and shooting clay bullets like a pro. What an education. Her picture is worth more than 1,000 words indeed, telling us what has the world come to. If we can get to the slide number 5, control room, please. We have a little technical problem here, so if we can get to that slide either now or later. It's really devastating to see how we play with our children's psyche. Perhaps we'll be able to see slide number 5. Slide number 5, please. Well, I think the technical there. So this is the 5-year-old Tamara who was crying, but his father was trying to teach her values, to shoot targets of Palestinians. I think that's really shameful. So in respect to gun ownership, we fall off the chart in every standard setting category for a modern society. Whether it has to do with the actual ownership of the gun or with the issue of a constitutional right, the Bill of Rights, Second Amendment, in terms of the ownership, or in terms of the legislation. Forget about the Second Amendment, which was way back in 1787 when the Constitution was drafted. We are talking about 2016, and still we have our legislators, our congresspersons who come and beg for our votes, and then they go to Washington, and then they kowtow to the gun lobby. In other words, they take the office, the elected office, in the name of the people, in the name of their constituents. And yet when they are in Washington, they act against the interest of their constituents, because we are the citizens. It's our lives that are messed up by their missteps, if we can conveniently call them. Because it's us, we who are paying the price. And yes, the mass shootings may have gotten all the publicity, but it is more than that. It's the ones that occur and do not make it to the 6 o'clock news. There is an idea here in terms of what then constitutes a civil society. In terms of using the word civility, and civilization, that are obviously derivatives of the same root, implies that laws that are made are there to establish order. Law and order, they go together. But in our society in America in the 21st century, in 2016, many of the laws are more geared toward protecting the interests of big corporations rather than the interest of individual citizens. Obviously, here I'm talking about the gun manufacturers, that it's their profit that has to be guaranteed. It's their investment, the investments of people who are buying shares and stocks in these companies. So then the moral question that is begging us is, for how long must we pay the price as our law empowers the criminals? And by criminals, I'm not talking about the armed assailant that breaks into someone's house in the middle of the night, because that armed assailant is not alone. That armed assailant breaks into someone's house with a gun that he had bought legally. So who made it legal for him? Who enabled him to have that gun, that heavy machine gun? Obviously, our politicians. So in reality, our politicians are participants in this crime. There's no question about it. So you have the actual perpetrator who pulls the trigger, but the responsibility of that act of perpetration, of invasion, of violence, of shooting, falls upon other entities too. So why is it that based on the charts that I shared with you earlier, comparing the United States with the rest of the world, how much we are off the mark so completely and so differently from the rest of the world, that 42% of the world guns, and again that was the 2009 statistics, 42% of the world's guns are owned by America. And obviously a much larger percentage of the guns that are manufactured by Americans. And these weapons then find their way to foreign countries, to some in the name of foreign aid, to others in terms of training their military experts, or sending our military experts to train their armed forces. So we arm them through the official channel, whatever the state might be. And I'm talking a foreign state as a government, not a state of the mind. Is that we sell more weapons to more countries than any country in the world. And who likes to buy weapons? People in those countries who need to protect themselves from their own people. That's right. I'm talking about dictators. And we support dictators because they buy our weapons. They expend their national treasury on buying American weapons rather than on health, education, and welfare, or building roads and schools and hospitals, which would be really serving their people, because in most of those poor countries, their economic and social infrastructure is so elementary and so basic that the priorities of any government would clearly put those, health and education and welfare, at the top. And yet the majority of the budgets of these countries headed by dictators is spent on weapons. And their only choice is whether these weapons should come from the United States or from France or England, the other democracies, or Russia and sometimes China and Brazil and Israel. And these are the countries that are bragging about human rights on the world stage in the United Nations. And yet they are the ones who produce these weapons and then who push these weapons on these vulnerable governments. And those vulnerable governments, those dictatorships, have to protect themselves against their own peoples because they have not gained power through a legitimate democratic political process. So they take power by force, and then the power is taken from them by force. By whom? By individuals and parties whose demand for political justice, for social justice in those countries, when their demands are frustrated, they resort to armed struggle. And yes, how do they get arms to have armed struggle? The arms come to them again from these major countries, Western countries, advanced, civilized, democratic countries who export guns, not just to the dictators who are in power, but also to armed groups within those countries. The beneficiary, of course, is the arms manufacturer. They sell to both sides. They devastate countries. And so you can see in this way that if certain principles of justice in, at least say, in our American judicial system was applied properly, then the perpetrator of an act of violence may not be just the person who pulls the trigger. but every other person who enabled him. If we are thinking about, to go back to the early analogy, the armed assailant commits a crime, the person who sells him the gun is a crime in that way too. In particular, when these weapons are battlefield type and not for civil use. I don't know what the civil use of a weapon is. And the politicians who make it illegal for the person to buy them. And the lobbyists, such as the NRA and others, they are all responsible for the action of assailants, whether they break into people's homes or to theaters or clubs or schools or universities and colleges. And yes, we have witnessed violence perpetrated in all of those places. A college campus is not a battlefield. A theater is not a battlefield. A club or a hospital is not. A kindergarten is not. We saw all of those cases. And yet, the perpetrators, not the individual, the collective of the perpetrators who are responsible for making that possible, for enabling the person to buy legally and to use it directly. And so this is the domestic side of it. But the international side is even worse. And it's worse because we have seen in many of these countries that where quote unquote civil wars continue perpetually, to a point that it's the weapon that determines the outcome of a political conflict. And since both government soldiers and armed oppositions are both using sophisticated weaponry made in the United States, France, England, Russia, Israel, Brazil, China, and elsewhere. Therefore, the presence and the use of roughly compatible size weapons makes winning those battles almost impossible, and if not, they linger them. And the longer these battles go, the more devastation they cause. And that's why these conflicts today, unlike in the past, where two armies would engage in a battlefield outside cities and towns to minimize, quote unquote, the collateral damage, and then the victors claim victory and the vanquished disappears, and that's the end of that, and citizens continue with their own life and way of life. But today, because our weapons are so lethal and they are so empowering, I hate to use this word in that negative context, but they are, that the more incentivized one is to use them, the higher their chance of winning. And since most of these third world countries, several of which I named, they may have large standing armies, but they have well-equipped, ragtag, armed resistors who engage these soldiers. In places like Afghanistan, for instance, on the surface of it, yes, there is a hooray and all claims of victory of the national army going here and there and fighting and winning certain towns from the opposition. And all you have to do is to wait for a week or two, then the opposition claims a victory in another town somewhere else in another part of the country. So this seesaw battle for temporary victories not only eliminates any hope but for stability, but also any chance of real peace taking over. And so therefore the argument that I'm making is that because of these weapons, these battles last and last and last. Somalia had been called a failed state. Does anyone ask the question, why did it fail? They failed because the opposition is equally armed, or armed with equally sophisticated weapons. They are a match. And so all of these things lead to more instability in most of these countries rather than to stability. And when the instability becomes perpetual and continuous, it questions the government's legitimacy, and therefore by default a state becomes a failed state. A concept that didn't exist before in our military political jargon in the past. So Somalia became a failed state. Afghanistan for a time became a failed state, and it's probably on the verge of it one more time. Iraq, sorts of. And Syria is embroiled in that state of being a failed state right now. And so the devastation, therefore, is such that I think our civil society, our modern civil society, has not acted responsibly. They haven't acted responsibly neither for the interests of our own people here in America, nor for the interest of people abroad, because it's the weapon manufacturers that are the real winners, and their winning is, of course, the profit. They keep producing, and weapons are not produced for any other purpose than to take life. This is not producing computers, cars, or some other equipment, lawnmowers, whatever, to make people's life better, but rather to take life itself in whatever name. And we have plenty who are willing to engage in this activity. Some in uniform, saluting a flag. Some without a uniform, saluting a deranged dictator or leader. They all use ideologies, religions, and other identities, social identities, to legitimize. But it doesn't matter what they preach. What matters is how they act, what crimes they perpetrate, and who's responsible for that. And in reality, the world is going backward because of the devastation. We right now have places like in Syria, where the Syrian government and the Russians are bombing a hospital or a clinic every 17 hours. Their main target is hospitals, where doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, due to their Hippocratic oath, their professional responsibility, the profession of humanity, humans sustaining human life, that profession has become a target. It's a killing machine, basically. And all it amounts to is that a certain individual must stay in power. And in order for him to stay in power, you can kill by the thousands. You can kill in hospitals, in clinic. You can barrel bomb them. You can form alliances. You can fly from here and there. And I'm sure many of you have seen the picture of that Syrian boy in the ambulance. Put yourself in that boy's place. Yes, you can claim him to be the victim of an Arab Spring gone awry. You can claim him to be the victim of foreign invasion. You can claim him to be the victim of many things: armed conflicts, civil wars, etc., etc. But ultimately, he is the victim of weapons. Weapons are the enablers of this violence that we perpetrate on our civil societies, who do not remain civil anymore, because in essence we have not been civil. So, the moral question we ask is that who reaps the profit of manufacturing weapons, selling weapons, through deals that are made through states and official policies? And who pays the price? Who pays the price? Remember the face of that Syrian child? And that wasn't the only one. I posted another one this morning in black and white. A barely 2-year-old baby who is under the rubble of a house with his father next to him. Both are dead, buried in the dust and debris of some bombing campaign directed by some politician who sits in the comfort of some palace in a faraway place, who knew nothing about who they were, what they amounted to. And the rest of the world here, we are sitting in the comfort of our seats too. And in essence, we have buried our heads in the sand and deny ourselves the decency of a 21st century civil society that we ought to have if we claim civility, if we claim civilizational high ground, if we claim intellectual prowess, if we claim democracy, and plainly, if we claim humanity that ought to have dignity with it. That we don't, and this is our state. I will leave you with that thought in preparation for a different dimension in the next program, where the militarization has gone further into gender differences, and it's racial, ethnic, police, security, and in every way, the world is being militarized continuously at a higher and a faster rate. And we will discuss that issue and the role of women in the military, both in the United States and abroad, and whether that's right or not. And if you have questions on that or suggestions that I should include in the next talk and the continuation of this forum here, please contact me through the email address that you see on the screen. Also, if there are questions that I haven't discussed fully here, that might have skipped my attention, or it may not have appeared there altogether, please contact me. So until then, I hope that some way, somehow, sometime, and I hope sometime soon, we can reconnect with our humanity to save our humanity. Have a good day.